Railroads, webs of steel that rapidly expanded into the transportation lifeblood of America in the closing decades of the 1800s. Like the rest of America, central Wisconsin was yearning for a transportation artery that would assure a progressive economy and dependable connections to distant cities. Before the railroads came, almost all of the supplies for Grand Rapids and Centralia were hauled in by wagon from Galena, Illinois, a distance of 235 miles. The trip took an ox team an average of 3 weeks. Communication with the outside world was by mail, which was received once each month out of Portage. The Green Bay route, originally known as the Green Bay and Lake Pepin, was first to reach Grand Rapids in November of 1872. And by January 1st, 1873, regular train service was offered between Grand Rapids and Green Bay. The days of the wagon and stagecoach were numbered. Unlike today, the passenger business was a very important part of early railroading. And by 1915, the Green Bay was carrying 310,000 passengers annually. By 1947, this number had dwindled to less than 1,000. And finally, on April 4th, 1949, the railroad was granted permission to discontinue all passenger service. In 1937, the Green Bay took possession of the first of 5 giant Mikado-type steam engines, the 400 series. These were indeed the finest, most modern steamers that ever ran through central Wisconsin. But diesel power loomed on the horizon, and these giant locomotives were soon destined for the scrap heap. Lucky the boy who has heard the wail of the steamer's whistle as it pounded through the countryside. And lucky the boy who could watch the little switchers as they went about their business in the railroad yards of yesterday. For steam yielded quickly to the diesels, and even before the last 400 series engine was delivered to the Green Bay route, their first diesel had already been put into service, and by 1952 steam power was finished on the Green Bay and Western. Soon the water tanks and coal elevators were torn down, for they would never be used again. This fine photo showing the depot, the freight house, the water tower, and the coal elevator was taken by William O'Gara, a local railroad historian. It was June 14th of 1873 that the Milwaukee Road reached Centralia, and by November of that year had extended as far as Junction City. Shown here is the original depot with a lineup of horse-drawn stages and taxis waiting to deliver passengers to their local destinations. Known as the North Woods Division in later years, passenger connections to Chicago and the Twin Cities by way of New Lisbon were excellent. By the 30s, the main line was operating the luxurious Hiawatha's, for a time the fastest trains in America. This smaller copy of the Hiawatha was running on the local North Woods Division. By the early 50s, passenger patronage and service began to dwindle, until finally, in the fall of 1970, permission was granted to discontinue all passenger trains in the division. It was on October 7, 1970. A few people boarded the train for the ride to Wausau, but the train would return empty to serve the Chicago-Milwaukee area. Demolition of the depot in 1973 was indeed the end of the once luxurious railroad era for central Wisconsin travelers. Where else but in central Wisconsin did the railroads share their tracks with another mode of transportation? This is Mr. Reuben Lindstrom. Reuben was a hermit who lived in a hut outside of the city, not too far from the railroad tracks. His primary mode of transportation was a bicycle, and to avoid highway traffic hazards and the insult of being splashed by cars in wet weather, Reuben designed a detachable device that fit the rails and gave him his own private railroad. When he neared town, he simply detached his invention, hid it in the brush, and rode the bicycle like any other cyclist would do. For many years, Reuben was a common sight on the streets of Wisconsin Rapids, until in the late 60s when he moved to Baraboo to live with a relative. The third railroad to service central Wisconsin was known as the Port Edwards, Centralia, and Northern, which was commonly referred to as the Pecan route. The Pecan was developed by a number of prominent businessmen, T.E. Nash, F.J. Wood, T.B. Scott, and others. It ran from Port Edwards to Marshfield, with the primary purpose of serving the paper industry. Just a few years later, another line was built from Port Edwards to Nakusa, known as the Marshfield and Southeastern. The year was 1896, and before the end of that same year, the new short line bought out the Pecan route. This Marshfield Southeastern car was photographed near the depot at Arpin around 1900. In 1901, the route was sold to the Wisconsin Central. This Wisconsin Central baggage car is on display at the North Freedom Railway Museum near Baraboo. In 1909, the Wisconsin Central was leased to the Sioux Line. This little red caboose is typical of the type used by the railroads in earlier days. Surely the old freight conductors would have envied their modern counterpart with his all-steel bay windowed caboose and two-way radio telephone. Eventually, the Sioux Line terminated the lease of the Wisconsin Central and purchased the line outright. This is a south end view of the Sioux Line Depot at 531 West Grand Avenue, as it appeared just prior to its demolition in 1974. The tracks were moved to a location near the Milwaukee Road tracks. The Chicago and Northwestern was the fourth and final railroad to reach Wisconsin Rapids. The year was 1901, and the local branch ran from Fond du Lac to Marshfield. A branch of the road also ran to Nakusa. In fact, for a time, the railroad offered twice-a-day passenger service to and from Port Edwards and Nakusa, until competition from the streetcar and automobile made service financially impracticable. This shot was taken from the top of the Northwestern water tower by Art Hager, a longtime agent of the Northwestern. The passenger car parked near the center of the picture is the one that ran to Nakusa. Freight cars were also a regular part of this train. In the early 30s, the Chicago and Northwestern introduced a different type of locomotion, the gas-electric. This was the forerunner of the modern diesel, fondly referred to by local residents as the hootenanny. We were unable to obtain a photo of the hootenanny, but this model is a very close replica of how the self-propelled coach appeared. It ran between Marshfield and Fond du Lac, making one round trip each day. Our producer cannot resist telling that he had his first train ride on the hootenanny. The trip consisted of a ride from Wisconsin Rapids to Kellner in 1937. The fare, 15 cents. Walking all the way back home on that February day was not too comfortable, but well worth the experience. Here at the Northwestern Depot, we take you back to the summer of 1950 to experience the closing days of the steam train in central Wisconsin. This was the morning passenger as it arrived from Marshfield on its daily run to Fond du Lac. It would be the last trip for this belching iron horse, and rail fans were on hand to join in its final departure. The hissing valves, the smell of cinders and steam would now become a memory of the past. A diesel would replace the steamer, and in a few years passenger service on the local branch would also be a thing of the past. Old-timers would never again see the familiar cloud of billowing smoke leading a train across the Great Bridge, which had been built in 1901. One cannot help but wonder what went through the mind of the engineer as he sat high on his throne and carefully guided the old steamer across the countryside for the last time. As the fireman tossed his last shovel of coal, he must have muttered, "Rest in peace, you slave driver." The railroads assured industrial growth. Our camera is located in the Wisconsin River just a few hundred feet ahead of the Consolidated Dam. We see it as it appears in 1975. But come with us now as we go back 100 years and visit this same area as it was at that time. Our opening picture is from an original of the Rablin and Robb Foundry and Machine Shop. It was located on the east bank of the river between the east end of the dam and the present-day location of the swimming pool, in the 1000 block of First Street North, then known as Water Street. The foundry and machine shop was built in 1869. Rain barrels on the roof were kept handy in case of fire. Here we see the Rablin employees posed for the picture, with Mr. Rablin himself standing in the middle. This building was later sold and converted into a flour mill. This is the mill that was built from the Rablin and Robb buildings. It was known as the Neeves Mill, owned by C.A. Podowiltz and George and William Neeves. In this 1890 photo, we're looking north across the Neeves Mill Pond toward the present-day location of the Sampson Canning Company building. In 1883, the Neeves Mill was incorporated as the Grand Rapids Flouring Mill Company. In 1889, it was bought by Thomas and John L. Nash and was then known as the Nash Mill until June 17th of 1889, when it was destroyed by fire. John Rablin also had a planing mill, which he later converted into a foundry and machine shop, as shown in this photo. In 1896, this was incorporated by new owners and known as the Grand Rapids Foundry. In 1905, the Grand Rapids Foundry joined with the American Carbonic Company and built a new brick plant on the west side of the river at 610 High Street. American Carbonic is no longer in business, but the High Street building still stands and is used as a trucking terminal by the CW Transport Company. The Grand Rapids Foundry owned the water power rights to their location on the east bank of the river and sold these rights to Consolidated. As a part of the purchase price, it was stipulated that Consolidated was to furnish 30 horsepower delivered by electricity on first demand and for all time to the American Carbonic plant on High Street. Just south of the Grand Rapids Foundry, at the 900 block of First Street North, was the Pioneer Lumber and Wood Pulp Company. Ultimately, this mill was absorbed by Consolidated along with other powers along the river from the Grand Avenue Bridge to Buren. The tall building in the background is the previously mentioned Neeves Flouring Mill. It's difficult to ascertain by which route the railroad reached this area, but the photos we have seen are proof of the existence of the tracks. The area just described is well covered in this photo, which was taken from the west side of the river. On the left is the Neeves mill, next is the Foundry, and on the exact site of the present-day swimming pool is the Pioneer Lumber and Wood Pulp Company. The old St. Peter and Paul Church, which stood until 1951, is also visible. The makeshift dam in the foreground was known as Lyon's Dam, which was typical of the type of dams along the river at the turn of the century. This was the original Jackson Milling Company on the west side, which was on a power site first owned by Daniel Whitney, who had entered it from the government in 1841. Daniel Whitney had established the first sawmill in the county at Whitney Rapids just 10 years earlier in 1831. Whitney sold this site in 1866, and the location evolved into the Jackson Milling Company. This shot was taken from about the location of the present-day swimming pool looking west. The Jackson Mill can be seen on the left side of the picture. With the need for more power rights, Consolidated purchased this location, and a new Jackson Mill was built at 3rd Avenue North, known as the Grand Rapids Milling Company. It's not possible in this film to tell the complete story of the birth and development of Consolidated Papers in all its complex detail, but it was all dependent on the acquisition of the various power rights on the east and west banks of the river. Perhaps most important of all of the acquisitions was the Mack and Spencer Mill, which was located furthest downstream of all the powers and was an important key to the development of a good head of water. The old Grand Avenue Bridge is visible in the background, which gives us an excellent reference to the location. It was in 1894 that Thomas E. Nash first conceived the idea of a consolidated company, the name Consolidated being in reference to the consolidation of the power rights we've just examined. In 1901, J.D. Witter and Nels Johnson acquired the whole stock of the original Consolidated Water Power Company. The production of paper was a natural course. On March 22, 1902, J.D. Witter died, leaving Nels Johnson and George W. Mead, Mr. Witter's son-in-law, to carry out the building of the Consolidated Mill. On December 16th, Mr. Johnson died at Wilmington, Delaware, where he had gone to buy machinery for the new mill. Mr. F. McKinnon was then elected president, and George W. Mead became vice president and general manager. For the new paper company, one success followed another. New equipment, new ideas, and massive expansion were all a part of the picture, even in the earliest days of Consolidated. Time does not permit us to go into detail in such a short film, but it is fitting to say that Consolidated has continued to prosper and maintain a reputation as a foremost leader and innovator in the paper industry, under the guidance of men like George Mead and those who followed him. Logging and power were not the only major industries in the early days of Grand Rapids. How could men survive without their beer? This was the Lutz Brewery, the first brewery in the area. It was built by a man named Schmidt in 1859 and was bought by Jacob Lutz and his brothers in 1880. Jacob Lutz was a jovial German whose measurements were said to be further around than up and down. This was a favorite place for J.D. Witter and a man named Squire Chase to get away from the downtown and meet old Jake in the serving room for a game of cards, where they would quarrel violently over points. The white building on the extreme right side of the picture was the first Wood County Courthouse, which was built in 1864 and located at 1231 First Street North. The Lutz Brewery burned on July 23rd of 1891. This account of the loss appeared in the Wood County Reporter and tells us that besides the brewery building, the loss included hundreds of barrels of beer, 2,000 bushels of malt, and 300 bushels of raw barley, besides many beer kegs that had never been used. According to the article, the Lutz brothers planned to build a modern new brick facility to replace the loss. This was another brewery that had been incorporated by Jacob Lutz for the purpose of making beer and a general brewing business. It was known as the Twin City Brewery and was destroyed by fire in 1895. Even in the earliest days, the small breweries had competition from the large Milwaukee brewers, as is in evidence in this ad from the July 16, 1891 issue of the Wood County Reporter. The Grand Rapids Brewing Company was incorporated in 1905 and flourished until the national prohibition law went into effect. In 1921, the brewery building was converted into a cannery and became known as the Grand Rapids Canning Company. There were many small companies that thrived in the early days of this area: furniture factories, foundries, wooden box and wagon wheel factories, just to mention a few. To cover them in detail would be impossible in this short film. A relatively latecomer to our industrial community was Preway, which was started in 1915 as the Prentice Webers Stove Company, with T.A. Taylor as president, G.N. Prentice as secretary, and C.W. Rood as treasurer. Their first products consisted of what was known as a collapsible gasoline camp stove and kitchenettes, which was a convenient combination of cooking utensils for camping purposes. Prior to this time, Mr. Prentice had manufactured hand-operated potato planters, which some say was the real beginning of Preway. The folding stove was very well received by the public all over the United States and Canada, and was exported to other parts of the world out of New York. Stoves for use in the home soon followed. Today's Preway product is a far cry from the little camp stove that started it all. Modern kitchen stoves and fireplace units are the bulk of the Preway business. And like the little folding camp stove, Preway products are still in demand throughout the world. New industries were founded on just about anything by 1902, and while we were busy selling lumber, paper, furniture, and wagon wheels, Sears Roebuck was selling this steam cabinet for just $2.95. Hair Restorer was selling at 60 cents a bottle and promised excellent results. 2 pages of Sears' catalog were devoted to electric belts, which promised to relieve all ailments common to men. And how about this electric ring for combating rheumatism? The customers was warned to beware of imitations. The ring sold for 50 cents plus 2 cents for postage. Yes, the world was changing all around us, and we were changing too. The changes of the future built upon changes and experiences of the past. Just as the expansion of our business and industries create the need for more power on the rails, the need for fast contact and communication has thrust us into the age of flight. With the indispensable help of sound financial institutions, for people and industry, we move ahead. Central Wisconsin, in step with today, in touch with tomorrow.